Hello, my name is Duel and welcome to my preliminary Lady Darkvein guide. This guide is intended to be as accurate as possible prior to the release of the Castle Nathria raid. However, as the raid is not live, some of the information in this guide may be slightly inaccurate. Lady Darkvein is the fourth of 10 bosses of the Castle Nathria raid, and is probably one of the more technical bosses of the raid. Lady Darkvein has 4 abilities which are tied to the 4 containers around the room. As these containers gain Enema, different abilities will be augmented, becoming more difficult to manage. In sequential order, they are the containers of Desire, Bottled Enema, Sin, and Concentrated Enema. The key to making this fight easy is managing the containers well. These 4 containers start at 0%, eventually reaching 100%. Players must interact with the containers, draining them of their Enema. As they are being drained, minor raid-wide damage occurs. In addition, the player that drains the container will receive a dot for 10 seconds. This dot stops players from spamming drain on the containers, so instead you must drain in large chunks. The abilities that containers correspond to are augmented at 33 and 66%, and if 100% is reached, massive raid-wide damage will occur. In addition, throughout the fight, Lady Darkvein will channel Enema into one of the 4 containers, accumulating Enema much faster. During this time, the channeled container cannot be drained, so at some point you will have to face all of Lady Darkvein's augmented abilities. This channel lasts for either 100 seconds or 25% of the boss's health, whichever occurs first. When either of these occurs, she will start with the next container. To manage containers well, players must drain any container that isn't being channeled when it reaches 33%. This ensures extra abilities aren't augmented whilst also reducing damage from draining. Players should pay attention to when the channel is about to swap, as you must preemptively drain the next container about to be channeled. 1, because if it starts at too high Enema, you will not be able to stop it from reaching 100, which will wipe your raid, but 2, because if you're able to time it well, you will spend the least time possible dealing with augmented mechanics. The target is to have the next container at 0% as she changes to that container. What you want to do on live is observe the rate that the container is drained at, and estimate how long until she transitions. So say there's 20 Enema to drain, and it drains at a rate of 2 per second, it would take 10 seconds to get to 0. So what you do is you estimate the point at which she will transition in 10 seconds, and have a player click the container at that time. Finally, when she changes the container that she's channeling into, the previous container should be immediately drained. Looking at the boss room, the boss should be tanked here in the center, with tanks positioned here, melee spread here, and ranged spread here. Ranged will probably have the easiest time dealing with the Enema containers. Lady Darkvein has 4 mechanics, and will use them all throughout the fight. However, with appropriate container management, you will only have to deal with the augmented abilities as she is channeling that container. They are Exposed to Desires, Bottled Enema, Lesser Sins and Suffering, and Lightly Concentrated Enema. Exposed Desires is the tank mechanic. It does heavy direct damage to the tank and applies a dot lasting 21 seconds. This dot does not stack, but will refresh with subsequent applications. Tanks should taunt swap every 22 seconds, only taunting back once the bleed is dropped off. Bottled Enema throws several bottles at locations across the room. All players stood in the 4-yard area take moderate damage, and if no player is stood in the area, everyone takes heavy damage. Only 1 player should move to these locations as they are about to hit the ground. Lesser Sins and Suffering will create 3 orbs in the room and link 3 players together, doing minor damage over time. Players must overlap their beams with the orbs in order to despawn them. If this doesn't occur in time, raid-wide damage will occur and it's a wipe. Finally, there is Lightly Concentrated Enema. Several players will be hit with a debuff that does mild damage over time, and after 10 seconds does moderate damage to anyone stood in 8 yards. Players with this debuff should gather near, but not on, melee, overlapping their areas like so. When the debuff expires, 1 Harnessed Spectre and several Conjured Manifestations will spawn. Bring the boss over to these adds and begin to cleave. The Spectre will need to be tanked at all times, otherwise it does heavy raid-wide damage. It also regularly does moderate direct damage with Unconscionable Guilt, and applies a stacking debuff increasing damage taken by both tank abilities by 10%. Tanks should continue to taunt swap according to Exposed Desires, however tanks swapping to Darkvein after tanking the Spectre will need to use cooldowns, as Darkvein will be hitting them harder. Conjured Manifestations cast an interruptible ability, which if cast does massive raid-wide damage and instantly recasts when it is interrupted. Create an interrupt order for each ad, and use interrupts just before the cast is about to be complete. Spectres should be prioritised over manifestations, as the damage from manifestations is avoidable if you interrupt properly. So those are the 4 basic abilities. Let's look at some of the augmented abilities. For the first one, at 33%, Expose Desires gains the ability Expose Cognition. This causes a random player in the raid to receive 10 seconds worth of the 21-second dot applied to the tank. Targeting is completely random, healers just need to top up whoever is affected. And at 66%, it gains Expose Heart. When tanks lose their dot, they will explode 8 seconds after the dot drops. The damage of the explosion is reduced the further the tank is away from the raid. So tanks will need to move out of the raid to drop Expose Heart, then come back and taunt swap. This ability adds an extra 8 seconds to the taunt swap, so it becomes every 30 seconds roughly. And remember, as she is about to reach 75% HP, or it's been 100 seconds, she will swap containers, so drain the next one before and drain the first one after she transitions. For the second set of augmented abilities, at 33%, Bottled Enema becomes Lingering Enema, which creates pools at the locations bottles are thrown at that deal damage over time to anyone stood in them. Nothing much can be done about the positions of these, other than moving out of the area as soon as they are soaked. Reposition the boss if there are too many near the raid. And at 66%, the bottles will bounce an additional time, so another player should be nearby the initial impact to soak a following AoE. It deals too much damage for one player to safely soak 2 pools. For the third set of augmented abilities, at 33%, Lesser Sins and Suffering becomes Sins and Suffering. This creates a beam between the orbs shortly after they spawn that does heavy damage to any players caught or who run through them. When these orbs spawn, players should quickly run out of the area to avoid being trapped. At 66%, these beams will begin to rotate, so they must be actively dodged. This makes things harder for players to line up their beams with the orbs. Players should time their movement so that they can all overlap their beams with the orbs whilst avoiding the rotating beams. And for the final set of augmented abilities, at 33%, Lightly Concentrated Enema becomes Concentrated Enema, which now roots players who are targeted with the debuff. This root is as soon as the debuff is placed on the player. There is no way of overlapping the players such that they won't be killed by the subsequent AoE damage if they are all stacked up. So all players should loosely spread 8 yards from each other before it is cast. Ranged can also move closer to the raid in case they are affected so that the ad is closer to the raid. At 66%, there is Highly Concentrated Enema, which spawns small orbs that move outwards from all players with the debuff when it expires. Any players hit will receive massive damage. All players must be aware of the orbs and watch the ground as they move, moving in between them. Melee will have a tougher time with this ability, as the distance between the orbs is smaller the closer they are to their spawn location. So those are all the augmentations. Just remember, the key to this fight is good planning and awareness of transitions. But that's the fight. So if you found this guide to be helpful, there's more like it on the way. I plan to release a new guide, probably 2 every day in the lead up to the raid, so look out for those. If you found it helpful, please like and comment, subscribe, all that. It'd help me a lot if you shared it with your mates. And also, if you're interested in raiding and are from OCE, our guild's always recruiting, so if you're interested, please shoot Emphatic on Bartholus a message. So yeah, my name's Dill, that's it from me. Hopefully this has been helpful to you guys, and good luck in the raid.